Hi, and welcome to creating a die line in Adobe Illustrator. So for this packaging die line, I've gone ahead and created a little schematic for my box. Anytime you create your packaging, it's best to start with a basic sketch on paper, and you can see that's what I had done here. I did a basic sketch. I took a photo of it and brought it into my computer so that you have a visual that I'm going to work off of. So the box that I'm going to be creating today is going to be 6 inches high by 4 inches wide. The sides of it are going to be 1.5 inches deep. And then of course we will build in the folds and the glue guides and the bleeds for this. So to get started building your package die line in Illustrator, the way I like to work, and this is not how everybody likes to work, but I like to work under the assumption that this size of the box may change at some point in the development process. You may be in a position where the art is not finished, your planogram is not finished yet, but your client may be wanting to see some of your thoughts and ideas and basic mock-ups. So I like to work with that kind of base assumption that I'm not working on a final size, so I like to build it in a way that if I need to adjust the die line later on, I don't have to go back and restart the die line from jump. I can go ahead and kind of maybe step back a little bit, but not totally undo what I've done. So in this way, I'm going to start with my rectangle tool because a basic box is just 4 rectangles all together. And I'm going to work a lot within my transform palette. So you can find that under Window, Transform. Right there if you don't have it open. So now while I could click and drag and draw these boxes out, I don't want to do that. I want to have Illustrator do some of this math for me. So I'm going to reset my reference point to the center here really quick, and I'm simply with my rectangle tool selected, I'm just going to click anywhere in my artboard size. That will pull up my rectangle tool. So I know that I want it to be 4 inches wide by 6 inches high, and I'm going to hit OK. So now I have a 4 by 6, and you can see that set in here to a 4 by 6. Great, so I've got one of those. Now I need to do the side. So I'm going to say that this is the back. There's my back. Let's do the side for it. Now I could draw another box, but I'm not even going to work that hard. I'm going to let Illustrator start building this for me from the Transform palette. So I'm going to copy this box, so Command-Control-C, and then paste in front, Command-Control-F. And then I'm simply going to flip it on the right axis point and say flip horizontal. Great, but that's too wide. It's now a 4 by 6, but I need it to be 1.5 inches wide. So I'll set my reference point there and drop the width to 1.5. Undo that real quick. I need to uncheck my constrain width and height. That's an important thing. So 1.5. Great. Now I have that. That looks much better. So now I have the back and I have the side. Cool. I could keep flipping this over and repeating that process, but that seems like a lot of work and I don't really want to work that hard on this. If I select both these pieces, I can see in my Transform palette that the width of those together is 5.5 inches wide. Well, I need to have a duplicate of those two boxes sitting right next to it. So in order to make Illustrator do that for me, all I have to do is set up a Move command. So to get into your Move dialog box, all you need to do is hit the Return key on your keyboard. That will bring up your Move dialog box. So I know I need this to be 5.5 inches away because that was the width of this, and I don't want it to move vertically. I only want it to move horizontally. So if I click preview, let's uncheck it. There it is. There, that's moved over. Now the magic. I'm going to hit the copy button, and that made an exact copy of that right next to it because this was 5.5 inches wide. I said make a copy of it 5.5 inches away. So that is mathematically perfect. So if I select the whole thing, I can see that this is 11 inches wide, which is what, accidentally hit my trackpad there. This is 11 inches wide, which from my measurement up here, if you added it all together, that would be 11 inches. So then the last thing that I need to make would be my glue tab here on the back. Now the reason it's here versus a different area is that I know that this is the front, and when it's folded, I don't want any obvious seams when viewed from the front. So I'm going to hide that glue tab in the back. So that way when the box is glued together, you can't see it. So that's why this is not the front, because when glued together you would see the seam along on this left edge. That's why this is the back. So that's something to keep in mind when you're setting up your die lines. You don't want to see any visible seams or where an item is glued together. That should always be hidden in the back or on the bottom. So I'll select this box again, and I'm going to kind of do that same move that I've done before. I do a Command C, Command F. I have my reference point set to the left. I'll say flip horizontal, and I'll say go ahead and only be a 1/2 inch wide for my glue tab. Now it's important that your glue tab hides, so you need to taper this. So when folded, if I just left this as a blunt edge and I folded it, if I didn't fold it exactly perfect, you may see the little top edges of this sticking out. So because this is a hidden item, this is where this is seaming together, I want to taper this down. So I'm going to take my direct select tool and I'll select the top point, and I'm going to go ahead and I can use my move dialog box again. I'll hit return. And I don't want it to move horizontal. I actually want it to move vertically. So I will say you don't move horizontal, but I can move it on a vertical position of 0.125, which is 1/8 of an inch. And I can select my preview to make sure that looks correct. Yes, that looks good. So this individual anchor point has moved 1/8 of an inch down. And how you know the positives and negatives, if you remember your XY grids from geometry class, positive on the vertical is down, negative is up. So I will hit OK. That looks good. And I'll do that same move on the bottom, except because I want it to move up, it needs to be a negative. I'll hit preview. There we go. That looks good. And now I've tapered this slightly, so even if it misfolds a little bit, that glue tab is still going to be hidden within the back. All right, great. So that was a really fast way to get some of these boxes together. So now I need to do the top and the bottom flaps, because right now if I just folded this, it would basically be a sleeve. So whenever you design your flaps for the top, you know you have to kind of measure that based upon the width of how deep that box is, because that's going to be the max. And it's super hyper important once you get this together to test your folds before you ever start laying out artwork. Once I get this die line done, I would send it to the printer, print it out, and double check just to ensure that all my measurements are correct, that it looks the right way, and likely send it over to my art director and make sure that that's looking the way it's supposed to. So, looking at the top, I know on the front, this should be the tallest flap because I want it to fold over the back flap. So again, that's not having the visible seams in the front. I have this nice clean look where I'm not going to see where this flap is. This will go over this one. Therefore, this one needs to be just a scotch taller than this one. So let's go ahead, and that's why this one says 1 1/4 versus 1 7/16. So let's go ahead and design for some of these. So I'm going to select all 3 of these pieces here, and I'm going to flip them up vertically. So I'll do a Command C, Command F, Control, paste in front, and I'll say go ahead and flip vertically. And now they're on top. But I know that these are all going to be different sizes. This is 1 inch because they need to tuck. So I will select this one and say from that bottom reference point, go ahead and make the height 1.25. And now that is the correct height that I want it to be, is 1 1/4 of an inch. This one I need to be 1 inch high so that it tucks in nicely. And then this one is going to be 1 7/16. So it's just a scotch taller. Cool. So now I know that those are mathematically the correct height that I need them to be. But the other thing, whereas we tapered these glue tabs, we also need to taper these flaps. Because again, unless you perfectly fold, you are going to see they will start running over the edges. So we need to do a little bit of tapering with these flaps. And you'll see that if you look at professional die lines, they will have a fairly large taper to them. So now that I have these shapes along the top, I need to go ahead and taper them just slightly so that way they tuck in. So I'm going to go ahead and select this left anchor point, and I'm going to hit return to bring up my move dialog box. I want to make a horizontal move of 0.0625 and a vertical move of 0. I'll go ahead and check my preview and say, yep, that looks really nice. That just tapers in slightly, and hit OK. I will do the same thing on the other side, except making that a negative. Hit OK. That's nicely tapered. Let's go ahead and do that again on this side. That remembers my last move, and on this one. So those are now nicely tapered so that they will tuck underneath. So if you happen to misfold at all, they're not going to go over the edges. So now let's look at this guy right here in the middle. So these little flaps will tuck in to kind of seal that box up, but I don't want it to be very close. It also needs to be tapered in, but I want to bring in a little bit of a more interesting kind of taper into it a little bit, and then more of an extreme taper. You can keep it fairly basic if you'd like to, but it needs to get a lot narrower in here. All right, so I'm going to add a couple more anchor points to this selection here to make it a little bit more of a complicated taper. You'll see this often in existing package designs. So when I'm adding new anchor points to this, I want to make sure that when I add them to the box that they're in about the same spot or as close as I can get. So I'm going to work with my rulers real quick. So I'm going to turn on my rulers. That's Command or Control R. Otherwise it is View, Rulers, Show Rulers. And I'm going to grab my pen tool, and I'm just going to add an anchor point onto both sides of this box. But I want those to be kind of in the same spot left to right. So I'm going to use my rulers to help me figure out how to get those in a little bit more of a correct spot. So let me select that. I'm going to move my, my 0 point to this bottom corner here. So that way it's going to measure the document at 0 and 0 from this bottom corner there. And then I will select just with my, I've got to grab my direct select tool. I will select my direct select tool, and it's almost a ½ inch. It's 0.46 inches away from the bottom. I'm going to move that down to 0.125. So it moves down a little closer, and I'm going to do the same thing to this one. This one's 0.5 because this should be my 0 here. I'm going to say you need to move down to 0.125. And now those are directly lined up with each other. So now I can grab both of these anchor points, and I'm going to go ahead and move them. So I'll hit return, move them, that 0.0625, great. And I'll move these, select this one and this one, hit the return key, and move that to the negative. So that makes that same move, just right and left. And you see I'm getting a little more interesting taper. This is moving away. So that way this is not going to, this die cut is not going to land super close to this one. It's just getting away. It makes it easier for the die cut machines to cut this shape out, because you typically don't put art on these little side flaps. This is the one you can kind of trim away from, and then you don't have to worry about putting interesting things on it. I'm going to taper this one just a little bit more So I will move it another 1/16 of an inch, and same with this one, so it tapers just a little bit more. And now I have a nice mathematically proportional tab. Now, because this was kind of a lot of work to do, that was a couple more steps to add those points to it. It's a little more moving, a little more tapering. I could do the same thing. I could have duplicated another one up here, but I know this is going to be the same size shape. This tab and this tab are going to be the same. So rather than do that exact same thing twice, I'm just going to do it once, and I'm going to duplicate this over here. So with this, I will select the whole piece with my selection tool. I'll hit the return key and say, all right, let's move 5.5 inches horizontal, no vertical move. That looks good. That looks exactly where it's supposed to be. And I will hit copy. Now I have another copy of that shape. I don't have to draw it again. So now that we have the entire top row here, set all the strokes to 1 point. So it's more visible for you. I've got all of my top flaps. That looks really good. Now I want to duplicate those onto the bottom of the box. And I could go through that whole process again, or I could just use my move tools and reflect these down onto the bottom. So I'm going to select all 4 of these. I will hit the return key, and I'm going to do a horizontal move of 0. I don't want them to move to right or left. I want them to move vertically. So I'll move them 6 inches. So they'll sit right along that bottom. Great, that looks perfect. I'm going to hit copy. Now, you'll notice that they're on this bottom axis, but they need to be flipped. So let's go ahead and open up our transform palette again and hit, with my reference point on the bottom, hit flip vertical. Perfect. Now those are exactly where they are supposed to be mathematically. I would never at any point was doing any clicking or dragging. I let Illustrator go ahead and do all of the math for me, so I didn't have to do the math. So now if we check back to our schematic, this is our basic box outline. This is the basic box die line. So next step is to do some finishing touches to get this actually ready for production. So in getting this die line ready for production, I want to kind of do myself a little bit of a solid favor and keep a copy of this, because I'm going to, right now these are all individual boxes that are movable, are adjustable. So I like to keep this somewhere, so if we come back and say, listen, 1.5 inches too big, too small, I can start working and manipulating from this shape as opposed to kind of redrawing my entire packaging die line. I can go ahead and move some of these sides around or move the height a little bit as I need to from the individual boxes. So if I needed to make this taller, I could, and I don't have to redo all of that work that I did. So I like just to select the entire thing. I'll make a copy. I'll hold down my Alt Option key here. I'll get that little black and white arrow. I'll clone it, and I'll just keep a copy off of my artboard somewhere for myself. I would delete this before this goes to my vendor. Go ahead and group that. So I have a little copy of that if I ever need to reference it again. You can also put it on a hidden layer. I like to not do that because sometimes hidden layers end up getting printed. I like to just take it off of the artboard just as a reference for myself. So now let's look at all of these pieces. So I need to start working in my layers palette to set up a die line layer and a fold layer and a glue guide layer and an art layer. So that way I have different layers for my different pieces of this die line. So I'm going to go ahead and open up my, my layers panel under Window, Layers. Right now I just have layer 1, and that's not really helpful for anyone. So I'm going to rename this to die line. And I'm going to go ahead and create a new layer that's going to be called folds. Excellent. And I'll create a new one in a second called glue guide. So where do I want my folds versus my die line? Typically, your vendor is going to say a solid line means it's getting cut and a dotted line means it's getting folded. There's more intricacies in there as far as what types of dotted lines and what colors you may need. That's going to be vendor specific depending on where you are printing these. And you may just send over to your vendor something that says, hey, these are my lines. So working with all of this, I need to turn these lines here into dashed lines to make them fold. Now there's 50 different ways you could do this, and there's really no wrong way as long as you are not moving these lines in any way. Remember, you want this to stay very mathematical. So I want this line on the bottom and this line and this line and this line to turn into one long fold line. This line down here to turn into one long fold line. This becomes a fold, this, and this. So I'm going to go ahead and copy all of this onto my folds layer, and I'm going to start kind of deconstructing it there. Great. I'm going to turn off my die line layer just so I'm not messing with that. And I'm going to start getting rid of some of these pieces. So I know that I don't need this guy because there's nothing really about this, because if I delete this, I have this line here. I've got that line. I've got that line. And I have that line. What I really need is to turn all this into dotted lines, with the exception of this here. Get rid of that too. So all this becomes dotted lines. So within my stroke panel, I'm going to check on dashed line, and you can set this up how you want it. 5-point dash, 5-point gap. That looks pretty good. So now that it's dotted, I'm going to change the die line color to a bright magenta so that I can see it. There we go. Now there's a little bit of a problem as far as overlap, because right now I have multiple boxes here. Depending on your vendor, they may say this is fine and you can just roll with that. Some vendors will not, because it'll register as two cuts. So it depends on your vendor. I'm going to go ahead and just do a direct select on that line there and hit delete. It doesn't look like much has happened, but stuff has happened. I'll do the same on this one, and I'll do the same on this one. So now I don't have any overlapping areas of where there's two paths on top of one another. This is a singular path. This is a singular path. This is a singular path. And then I'll go ahead and group all of this for my fold lines. I'm going to go ahead and get back into my layers panel, and I'll turn on my die lines. And you see that kind of obliterates them a little bit. So I want to make sure that these are kind of exclusive. I don't want the fold lines to show here. So I'm going to kind of do a quick and easy way to make this whole thing one big piece. First, I'm going to lock the fold layer so I don't mess with it. You can also toggle off the visibility. So I want this to become one continuous die line all the way around, so that this is one piece. I don't need any of these things in the middle here, because those are now my fold lines. So I'll select all of this. I'm going to open up my Pathfinder view, which is also under Window Pathfinder. And I'm going to click the Unite key. And that will unite this all into one big shape. That now becomes our true die line. So this would be the die line. Now I'm going to turn on my folds, and you can see that they're now on separate layers. Got the folds here, the die is here. I'm going to go ahead and change my die line color to be blue. There we go. And that looks great. That is 90% of the way there to being. So some of the finishing steps on this is going to be putting in your glue guides. So working from the layers panel again, I'm going to create a new layer and I'm going to name it Glue Guides. And depending on your vendor, they may be okay having this all be one layer, all die cut information. Some vendors may say we want it all separated. It entirely depends on who you are working with. So my Glue Guides layer just tells my vendor, anybody who's producing this, where they need to put glue. So I know that this flap in the back needs to glue to the side flap. So I'm going to go ahead and create a little rectangle that will fit in here. And if I remember from my schematics, I set up that glue flap to be 1/2 of an inch. So the glue can't quite touch the edges of the die when they put that strip down, so I need it to be a little bit away from either side of it. So I'm going to go ahead and then remembering that this is 6 inches high. So I'm just going to let Illustrator help me out with that math a little bit. I'm going to create a rectangle that is going to be 0.325 inches wide by just under, so 5.75 inches high, and hit OK. I'm going to give this a nice blue fill so that I can see it. So this is going to be where my strip of glue is. And that may be just a bit too high. So I'm going to go ahead, because it's running into that a little bit, I'm going to go ahead and knock it down to 5.5, just so that it's staying away from my die line. There. So this becomes a strip of glue. So this also communicates then to my vendor how much glue they need to be using when gluing this together, whether it's a big chunk of glue, whether it's a small chunk of glue. I'll grab my type tool and I type in the word glue. Go ahead and make that white. Rotate it and put it right here, so that way it just communicates then to my vendor that glue goes there. So that information's on my glue guide layer. I also need to put one along the bottom flaps as well. So let me make another, the width of this is going to be 4.5, excuse me, not 4.5, 3.5, because it's 4 inches wide already, so I need to kind of scooch in under that, and then I'll set the height to 1/4 inch. Give that the same blue fill. And I'll mark that. And there's that glue guide on the back, and then I also want one along the top so that I know to glue that flap shut as well. So I'm going to select both of those pieces. I'll use my return key and set the horizontal move to 0. I don't want to move it side to side. I do want to back it up, so I will move it back 7.25. Should double check my math before recording this. Let's find out. Copy. That was close. I needed to move that another inch. Did not double check that math. A full inch, let's do 0.75. That's what I wanted. All right. And move that so it aligns along the top so it'll glue underneath this flap. Typically you don't glue the entire thing. Your customers won't really like opening it, but you want to communicate where this is going to glue. So now if I double check into my layers panel, I can see that I have my glue guides. So if I toggle that on and off, there's my glue guides, there's my folds, and there is my die line. So far this is looking really good. I'm going to go ahead and, since I've got the folds layer locked, I'm going to go ahead and lock the glue guides layer now that I'm done with it. And I'm going to return to this die line layer. Because one of the last things I need to do is to set up my bleed. So your artwork always needs to bleed at least 1/8 of an inch over. You may need to check specifics with your printer if you're doing like a flexo type of print where if you're doing sometimes large pieces of packaging with that plastic or something like that, they may need a larger area, but typically industry standard is 1/8 of an inch of a bleed beyond your die line. And typically you do not want to go over that 1/8 of an inch because every extra little bit of ink that is printed adds to the cost. Ink costs money. So if you're having artwork way, way, way over the die line and it is getting printed in a commercial printing, that can drive up the cost. So you don't want to needlessly drive up the cost of production for artwork that's never going to be printed or seen. It's just going to end up in a trash heap. So I will select this piece here, my die line, and I'm going to go to Object, Path, Offset Path. And I'm going to set my offset to 1/8 of an inch, which is 0.125. I'll check preview. And you can see that that has gone 1/8 of an inch all the way around. You can set the joints to miter since this is kind of a square shape. You could set it to round. If you have more rounded edges in your die line, I would keep them rounded. Or if you start getting kind of funny joints, and I will click OK. Now I have this path that this is where all my artwork is going to bleed to. So I need that line to come onto my art layer because when I work within my art, that's what it needs to clip into. So I'm going to create a new layer. I'm going to call it Artwork. I will put that below my die line. And then I'm going to move this, just click that square, move it down to Artwork. So if I lock my die line, I can toggle all this off and I can see that this is where that bleed line is. So I like to keep that as an active path for myself to work with. So when I get to the point that I'm done with my artwork, I can clip everything into that path. It's also nice to make a copy of it and turn it into a guide if you'd like to. So I can do Command C, Command F, which is paste in front, and Command 5, which is turn it into a guide. So that will make this a guide that I can now work from if I'm bringing in my guides and measuring everything out. So if I turn my guides off, that path is still there. So now that I have all of these pieces and parts ready to go, gone ahead and locked these so that I can't work within them. I now can start building this in my artwork layer and start laying out my packaging. There's a couple more kind of finalizing steps that we need to do that may or may that are sometimes optional depending on vendors, but I will show you how to do them so that way you're kind of getting the. So some of the finalizing steps, these are optional depending on the company that you work for, the vendors you work for, would be putting in some of this template information, such as how big is this box. So these schematics that we worked out up here, a lot of times vendors want to know that full information of how big exactly is this. Because they want to ensure that when they receive this, it's communicated to them how wide is this actually supposed to be, that it will be written in the slug of this artboard how big the box is. So putting in that measurement information for your vendors, as well as what is the front, what is the back. Particularly if you are handing this off, or this becomes a die line key that maybe is used by multiple designers within an organization. These finalizing steps allow you to communicate beyond your own personal use of correct measurements, correct front, back, all of these things. It makes this a very portable document that any designer can work from. So let's go ahead and set these things up. So I'm going to create a new layer and I'm going to call it template. You can also call it information. You can call it die cut information. Those would be correct. And I'm going to move it underneath my artwork because I do want it to get obliterated once I put artwork in. And I'm going to start drawing some of these arrows. So I'm going to use my line segment tool. I will actually speed up the recording here so you're not watching me draw all of these arrows. But I simply am going to draw an arrow that I'm going to use my transform panel as well. So I know that this is 6 inches high. I want a line segment that is 6 inches in length. 270 degrees is fine. That makes a vertical line. It is blue. I'm actually going to make this black. And I'm going to add arrowheads. I'm just going to use some of the default ones that come with Illustrator. I don't like using the great big chunky ones. I actually like number 10. It's nice and small for me. So that has beginning and ending arrowheads. So if I look at this, they actually look very small on this screen. I'll make them a little bigger so you can see them when you're watching this video. The arrowhead in general doesn't matter. It's simply showing that this is going to be 6 inches high. So I'm going to type in next to it 6 inches. So that I'm now communicating to my vendor when they print this that this measurement here is 6 inches. So I'm going to go ahead and speed up the recording here real quick, and I'll see when I've got all these measurements put in. So after a couple magical minutes here, I've gone ahead and finished up all these measurements here. They are, so it's showing and communicating with whoever works on this how wide each of these parts are. So 1/2 inch wide, 4 by 1.5 by 4 by 1.5 for the sides. And then I went with the tallest measurement for this, and then the overall measurement, width and height for the entire box. So when they cut it to the die line, what is the overall height and width of this when it's going to be produced? That's a measurement you're going to want to be concerned with, or that you would want to communicate with your printer when you turn this in. So this also lets people know when they're working on it, how big is this box? I can look at it and go, yeah, it's 4 by 6 by 1.5. Just from looking at this measurement, I don't have to sit and click into any of these pieces and parts here. So I've got those measurements on this die line within this template layer. I'm also going to mark what the front and the back is. Hopefully you would know, but this prevents any designer from designing the front of the artwork that would be on the back, and then you would have a seam. So I just like to write front in kind of big gray letters here, so that way I can see it. So that way everybody knows. No one can get this and make a mistake on this. Go ahead and clone that and just turn it into back. That doesn't really matter placement wise, it's just that communication. You may also want to put the name of, if you had to name your product up here, so if you had a part number, so something like a part number would go up here, a job number, all of that you would want to put into some of the information on the sides of this. So now that I've got all that information in here, all that's on my template layer, I'm going to go ahead and turn it into a template so that it's there, but it's nothing that I'm going to accidentally edit. So with this layer selected, in my layers panel, I will click on the flyout and I'll just hit template. So you can see that turns this into a template layer. You can still toggle it off, but it by default locks it. It turns it into a template. So it is editable, but it's a little bit trickier than to accidentally edit that, because it's meant to communicate to somebody that that's kind of this extraneous information that shouldn't print. You don't want this to print. So I may also adjust my artboard down. I just made this a default 11 by 17. I don't need this much space. Depending on your vendor, they may want you to clip the artboard all the way down to the bleed size, so keep that in mind. Other vendors may want this information in your slug area, so it is kind of dependent on who you're working for. So now that I have all this set up, I am ready to start working. So let me show you how this would then work. I've got all these layers locked so I can't mess with them. That's really important. If I was to turn this over to somebody, I don't want them to destroy my hard work. I'm going to go ahead and work within the artwork layer. So I'm just going to pretend that I'm making some different things. There's a nice box. Let's make that yellow. Neat. I'm going to go ahead and do some artwork on the sides here. Let's make that red. This is all just dummy artwork, just so you can see what working with this would be like. Let's do one last little piece here. Great, now that looks really good. So I've got this created. I've made my artwork go way past the bleed lines. Now, like I said, it's depending on your vendor, they may not want you, and typically you should not ever put a lot of artwork way past your bleed. The reason being is that ink costs money. Depending on your printer, they may kick it back to you as an error. It also messes with you visually. If I had green all the way out to here, I know that that's not going to print past this line, but yet visually that's a little bit unsettling to me as a designer. That starts messing with how things optically look. So it's good to work within your actual space that you can work in. So I'm going to go ahead and select that offset path that we had made earlier in here. I'm going to bring that to the front. So Object, Arrange, bring to front. I would select then all of my artwork on this layer, and then I can go Object, Clipping Mask, Make. You see how that's now lovely clipped into that bleed line. So I can already see that I have some areas of interest here that I would want to fix, particularly here. This is going over the fold, and you can see where it's causing an issue in the bleed. You kind of want to split that, but that's neither here nor there. But that's why you would make that offset path. So you now have that nice bleed line you can clip all your artwork into, and now you are ready to begin working on creating your artwork within Illustrator to create your packaging die lines. So I hope this has been helpful for you, and good luck working on your packaging. I'll see you on the next one.